I'm glad for Jake. They're basically doing everything I wanted him to do in his opening statement. So he's handing me a lot of gems, and it's going to jive perfectly with what I put in my opening statement as to exactly where I knew he would go. So let's talk about Salafi Islamic absurdity, and that's, of course, the position that Jake represents here. And we're going to look first at how one of his representative theologians that he said represents the Palamas of Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, particularly in his book on the oneness of God, we're going to note that it's a massive Christian fail. And we're going to see the similar fails that Ibn Taymiyyah makes in understanding Christian theology basics that Jake himself made when it came to the triad, for example, by reducing the idea of begetting to being an energy. Begetting is not an energy. So for Jake's argument to hold that he made earlier about the triad, begetting would have to be a common energy, and it's not. First of all, Ibn Taymiyyah posits at the outset of his book an eternal world existing eternally separate from God based on an infinite regress of worlds. Now, Jake has made many critiques of this view and others, so it'd be interesting to see if he rejects a basic idea in one of his basic Palamas-like theologians of the Islamic tradition. Second is Ibn Taymiyyah posits the Trinity as contradicting natural reason. This is a problem they're going to notice later on in Ibn Taymiyyah, as well as Jake, given that he doesn't understand the transcendental argument, as he made clear in his opening statement. That's going to be very relevant for where we go here in a minute. Arguing that the Trinity makes energies and attributes persons is a move that Ibn Taymiyyah makes, which is false. He attributes to us the Nestorian view of Christ as two hypostases, which is false. And he attributes to us an Arian modalist view of the Trinity collapsing person and nature and God on pages 22 to 24. Now, he may not believe those things, and you may not believe those things, but that's not our position as Orthodox. So if we're going to be arguing against the Orthodox position, you can't set up a straw man and say that you're knocking down the Orthodox position when it's the Arian or Nestorian position. Thus, Ibn Taymiyyah and Islam in general fail to understand, typically speaking, the Orthodox Trinitarian dogma, when they create a straw man as a formula, as formulated in our councils, which reject Arianism and Nestorianism. This would be like me basically calling Jake a Sufi and then proceeding to refute that position. Jake's failed account of unity and multiplicity in Allah. This has come up in a few debates now with Jake. But what is being debated here between us is not actually a pure Unitarian position of Jake versus the threeness position that I have, but rather two different ways of accounting for unity and distinction in God. Jake would like to give the impression that his position is free from all issues that relate to multiplicity, but in passing debates, we will see that this fails. Jake believes that the attributes of God are, according to Ibn Taymiyyah's two principles, really distinct amongst themselves from God's essence. What applies to one attribute also applies to all the others and equally to God's essence. This includes affirmation and negation, true whether we know the meaning or not, except the plain meaning, as Jake said in his opening statement. Attributes are comparable to creatures in terms of perfections, which creatures partially have, while God maximally has this perfection in a way befitting him. Thus, likeness in these cases is, quote, in name only, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ergo, it tells us nothing, especially with Jake's nominalist empiricist position, which he admitted. We will look at this in a second, so keep that in mind. True for thee, not for me, the Jake brand. Jake believes that the attributes are really distinct and inseparable. Did you hear him say that in his opening statement? That means counting by division. But he also distinctly identifies the attributes as really distinct from each other and from the essence. That's counting by identity, which in the same boat places him in the same boat as Trinitarians when accounting for the distinction of hypostases, counted by identity, and the divine essence, counted by division. Note, I did not say that Jake thinks that Allah's attributes are persons, or that we think attributes are persons. That is Jake's straw man that he often uses in many discussions and live streams when he attempts to rebut this argument. But rather, Jake makes the same move when accounting for unity and distinction in God that we do, yet he calls us out on it. This is, in fact, Jake's guilty double standard. Furthermore, Jake and Ibn Taymiyyah are allowed to engage in affirmation claims about Allah, which we call cataphatic theology, that he would call idolatry in Christianity. Jake often states the Trinity incarnation is pagan. We will look at examples in a moment, but this illustrates another double standard where Allah's body parts are considered real, but not created. Foot, hand, eyes, etc. What is an uncreated foot that is nothing like a human foot? What, by the way, is a more perfect foot? Does the God foot have toenails? Isn't a foot with toenails more perfect than a toenail deficient foot? In other words, it tells us absolutely nothing and it reduces to absurdity. Also, Ibn Taymiyyah argues that God laughing is somehow more perfect than him not laughing. I'm interested to see how Jake accounts for this. It would then follow that eternally laughing is better than laughing once. So God is eternally lolling. In other words, a clown God. Remember, what applies to one attribute, according to Ibn Taymiyyah's rules, applies to all the others. If there's an infinite series of created worlds and causes, then why would we ever need a single being? Also a position of Ibn Taymiyyah. Contingent means dependent upon something else, but it's begging the question to say that it's a single necessary being. So Ibn Taymiyyah might cash this out, or Jake, in two different ways. If it's a causal relation, then he's engaged in the quantifier shift fallacy, that every event has a cause, and so that every event has one cause. If every event is contingent, such that there's a transference to the whole, that's the parts whole fallacy. Because if every being is contingent, therefore the whole is contingent, is in non sequitur. For example, my room is made up of atoms. Atoms are invisible, therefore my room is invisible. This is a non sequitur. And this relates to the two types of argumentation that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks is rational argumentation for the existence of God. Created acts in God's essence. Jake is quick to claim idolatry in our position, but holds actual idolatrous views by positing actions in the essence of God, unless he again departs from the guy that he says is his palamos. So in Suleiman 241, the Ibn Taymiyyah and the attributes of God, we have this pointed out that, in other words, temporal acts are contrasted with eternal acts. Jake makes this argument himself, and Jake may counter that created acts are now eternal. That is a contradiction. It also creates an attribute that contradicts Ibn Taymiyyah's principle number one of what is applied to one attribute then applies to all, meaning that all the attributes are now created and temporal, or temporal acts are eternal. It also violates Ibn Taymiyyah's principle number two, which applies to the attributes in God's which applies to the attributes applicable to God's essence, meaning that God's essence is now temporal. Idolatry, will remind you, is ascribing to creatures the divine nature or worshiping creatures as God. This may also be why Jake thinks God's knowledge is had through discursive propositions, and that's precisely why he thinks the indexicals argument in a debate from modern analytic philosophy applies to his ideas of God. I can simply reply that God's mode of knowledge is not equivalent to creaturely modes of knowledge, and since Jake can at will invoke the idea of we don't know the modality, well, we don't know the modality of God's knowledge. But I also might just simply deny that God's knowledge is discursive or indexical. More problems for Jake, perfectly laughing. Do the attributes of Allah, considered in themselves, possess aseity? This has been asked to Jake in the past, and of course, Jake has not had an answer to it. Is one attribute considered in itself less perfect than all of them compiled together, or all of them plus the essence? Remember, a lot of this theology is going to be built on perfect and less perfect metaphysical assumptions. And we're going to see in a moment that he doesn't even have the ability to get to predicating metaphysical claims at all. Why is laughing and turning his face, quote, more perfect than not? And it's actually argued by Ibn Taymiyyah in the book, the Suleiman book. We might ask, what is a more perfect laugh? Was it a perfect laugh? Was it merely a snicker? Why must we arbitrarily stop in inquiring about this meaning? If it's they will typically say, well, it's a laugh that befits the majesty of Allah. This again tells us absolutely nothing. And in fact, it's circular because it's not telling us anything. It's just another supposed attribute that tells us that Allah is more perfect. So that's a circular claim, which even Ibn Taymiyyah rejects circularity. If being is part of what it is to be perfect, then God must be seen to be perfect. Yet Ibn Taymiyyah says that God cannot be seen. Even Suleiman notes in the book on Ibn Taymiyyah, page 252, this is a flat out contradiction. And again, we're going to see tons and tons of contradictions when it comes to basic ideas about predicating about God. What is the a priori idea, by the way, of metaphysical perfection here? Where does Jake derive it? How do we know this? Well, it turns out it gets even worse, because Jake, Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology, as he noted, is an empiricist nominalist epistemology. Jake's position cannot get off the ground in terms of predication at all. And if this argument holds, all of his argumentation about Tawhid will then fail. This is because Jake has put his metaphysical cart before his epistemic horse and is engaging in a host of unjustified, arbitrary, and contradictory claims. Empiricism is the view that knowledge arises from sense data or relations of ideas. Nominalism is the view that universals have no real existence. And for Ibn Taymiyyah and for Jake, they're purely mental and solely particular. A committed nominalist, however, must grapple with the following problems. There is no empirical perception of, quote, necessity, being, cause, or any other metaphysical claim. This then undercuts all of his theology and theology claims. There's no empirical perception of the peripatetic axiom, the idea that what's in the mind derives from sense data. This is a position that Ibn Taymiyyah holds. There's no empirical perception of, quote, reason or, quote, self-evident truth. We note that Ibn Taymiyyah affirms self-evident truths, as most Sunni do as well, and I assume Jake does as well. There's no empirical perception of the universal that is abstracted by the intellect through the phantasm, something cribbed from Aristotle, also present in Ibn Taymiyyah. The universal is thus not a universal if it's only merely particulars. I forgot to put the footnote there, but I can add it. There's no empirical perception of, quote, perfection, meaning all the arguments that hinge Allah's perfection on maximally creature-like perfections also then fail. There's no empirical perception of identity over time. If you're an empiricist, these arguments are arguing. And by extension, no perception then of meaning over time. In other words, I can just take Hume's critiques of identity over time and apply them to Jake's position, which is a not consistent empiricism. It turns out, actually, David Hume's empiricism is way more consistent, and that's why we can use these arguments. In fact, Jake might think this isn't fair, since this is a debate about Tawhid and Trinity, but again, he brought up transcendental argumentation, so I don't feel unfair now. But if all this about predicating about the attributes is based on a faulty epistemology of naive empiricism and a faulty metaphysic of nominalism, then every sentence Jake makes fails to be justifiable or even coherent, as all predication itself is now impossible, much less divine predication. Indeed, the Oxford Handbook of Islam even notes that Ibn Taymiyyah is a Hume and a Locke before Hume and Locke. Thus, as such, he will be subjected to the exact same critiques that we make of Hume and Locke. Ibn Taymiyyah, principles of reason are self-evident. On page 196, we're told it's Ibn Taymiyyah's view, and I assume Jake's as well. It's a form of classical foundationalism where the first principles in terms of reasoning are self-evident. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, they require no justification. If this is the basis of his reasoning in general, and by extension of the theological reasoning of Quranic explanations, then we see no basis for this assertion. If Jake can be arbitrary, so can I. Jake, I can just claim that the transcendental argument requires no justification. It just is the case. Now, I don't actually think that, and I'm going to address your misunderstanding of the category error that you made between logical and metalogical argumentation, but that'll come later. What is the non-self-referential, non-circular basis for you as a kind of foundationalist for thinking that the principles of reasoning are self-evident? What determines self-evidence? If it's based on something else, then it's no longer self-evident. If it's not based on something else, then there's the problem of arbitrariness. Furthermore, there's the criteria problem. What is the more fundamental principle by which you classify self-evidence from non-self-evident truth? Example, for example, IT admits in many passages that are disputed in the Quran in terms of their meaning, yet we're told that the plain, simple meaning is accessible to all and becomes extremely complex, however, when we see Ibn Taymiyyah lay out 4 rules for knowing when it's figurative versus the plain meaning. Now, this you can see was a huge source of dispute between him and Dr. Khalil in their debate, where they were trying to figure out between various Quranic texts, the pen, the tablet, this, that, the hand, the foot, what's literal, what's figurative. And Jake says, look, we're going to go to the rules laid out by my scholars. How do we know that those rules are the correct rules? In other words, it's just moving the problem back a step. Given that Jake rejects the incarnation as a pagan contradiction, we can return to the body parts, which are clearly anthropomorphic. Attributes are claimed to have a practical teaching, a value that would be useful for 7th century Arabs and Jews or even Christians hearing the text. Yet the plain meaning is championed by Ibn Taymiyyah and the Salafi. It's based on analogy or likeness that is immediately divested of all the meaning, making the statements empty and contradictory. Hand, foot, face, laughter, above the throne, descent to the lowest heavens are all, quote, affirmed and then stated to be unknown in modality. In other words, the God foot is a foot that befits Allah, but it's nothing like a human foot. Even Suleiman notes of Ibn Taymiyyah that he plainly contradicts himself here on body parts on page 331. as well as on the notion of creaturely and divine perfections on page 252. It is a hand that's unlike empirically known hands, is basically what we're saying here. Yet we're expecting every person in this century to just simply know that, well, clearly it's not talking about a creaturely hand, even though we are empiricists. And so lastly, I would note that the Trinity is a doctrine that is not far-fetched. Basil in letter 234 says the energies come down to us. And then monarchical Trinitarianism, which I think we'll get into, my time is running out, is a combination of counting by unity, by division, and identity.
Divinity raises the humanity of Christ through theosis, and that's exactly what we experience.